Okay.
All right, very good. Thank you so much, Rachel. And again, thank you all for being here, taking time out of your day to come have a conversation about land grant, land grab universities. My name is Joseph Bauerkemper. I serve on the faculty in the Department of American Indian Studies, as we call it here at the University of Minnesota Duluth. And I also serve as an affiliate faculty member for the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, which is part of the University of Minnesota system. I teach across a lot of different programs. Here at UMD, we have undergraduate degrees, an interdisciplinary program in American Indian Studies. We have an undergraduate degree in tribal administration and governance. And we have two master's programs, professional degrees. One of them is a master's in tribal administration and governance, and one is a master's in tribal resource and environmental stewardship. And I'm honored to teach courses across all of those programs. We also have graduate level certificates that are kind of subsets of courses from those graduate programs. So a handful of those in more narrowed topical areas, tribal sovereignty and law, resource economics and stewardship, various certificates in that realm. So really happy to be involved in a lot of programming, because that means I get to engage with a lot of students who are doing really cool work and innovating and minding their relations in really important and impressive ways. And I'm grateful to do all of those things. At the Humphrey School, we have some courses in tribal relations there that we do, intergovernmental relations kind of coursework for the Humphrey School. I'm really happy to be a member of the network, the Lake Superior Living Labs network, and have learned a lot through the various resources entailed in that, and really honored again that y'all have taken some time out of your day and that the network decided to have a webinar on this topic of land grab or land grant universities. And the title for this session is Land Grab University, and then followed by the words existence and obligation. And so I'll be thinking about the concept of the land grant or the land grab university, how it is that institutions such as the one where I'm employed, University of Minnesota, how it is that the University of Minnesota exists, and what obligations I understand that to entail. So I will be keeping this fairly informal. I have a few comments to make and thoughts and hopefully contexts to illuminate. And then I want to invite as much conversation as we can. And I certainly invite you to unmute, to heckle or ask questions or offer insights, comments, corrections. Please feel real free to do that at any point. Don't worry about derailing me, because I'm already off the rails in some sense. So that would be wonderful to have any kind of engagement that you're so inclined to contribute. So I'm here in Duluth, Minnesota, which is within an 1854 treaty territory. So in 1854, Native nations of this region, this is shortly after there was a conversation about where the potential border between the United States and Canada would be. That was a future-oriented conversation, because they hadn't, the United States and Canada didn't have much jurisdiction up in these parts in the mid-19th century at all. But they nevertheless had a bit of a presumptuous conversation about where they might draw a line between themselves. And then based on that conversation, each of those respective governing entities entered into its own building more and more diplomatic relationships with Indigenous nations. And one of the many things that grew out of that is the 1854 treaty relationship between the United States and the Grand Portage, Bois Forte, and Fond du Lac nations, or bands of Ojibwe. And that 1854 treaty is the reason that the place where I sit today, Duluth, Minnesota, is commonly understood to be under United States jurisdiction. That treaty created a sense among the United States government that the United States has jurisdiction in what we now call northeastern Minnesota, or the Arrowhead region of Minnesota. And so I happen to be a U.S. citizen, not a citizen, a member affiliated, not affiliated with any American Indian nation. I'm a non-Indian settler citizen of the United States. My U.S. citizenship as far as the structures of the United States are concerned, allow me to live in Duluth, Minnesota. And I do so by virtue of that, which is completely reliant upon the 1854 treaty. If it weren't for that treaty, my U.S. citizenship would have no purchase here whatsoever, would have no significance in this place. And so here I am sitting in my office exercising settler 1854 treaty rights. And a lot of obligation is entailed in that. And that's sort of the fundamental story that I want to share with you today. But of course, we'll be looking at what that means for the University of Minnesota. So let's back up for a second, not chronologically, but just conceptually. And I'll say a little bit about land grant universities, and my apologies for the likelihood that 80% of this room knows more about this than me, but it's possible that some of you are not terribly familiar. So I'll go ahead and indulge myself at least and say that land grant universities are this phenomenon, this concept created under particular pieces and really one primary piece of federal legislation here in the United States that arises in the 1860s. And so in 1862, we call it the Morrill Act. The Morrill Act is passed, and you might hear that 1862 and recognize that there's a lot going on both in domestic affairs. There's a civil war happening in the United States, and Indian affairs. There's all kinds of things going on, especially here in Minnesota. And so 1862 is pretty thick with a lot of layered contexts. So the Morrill Act comes forth, and the Morrill Act creates this mechanism through which federal lands, or what are understood to be federal lands, are assigned, parcels of federal lands, specific federal lands, are assigned to states, or states can gain sort of land assignments, federal lands. And under the Morrill Act, states are to use these lands, whether through selling them and getting revenue that way, or through revenue that can come from operation, if you will, of the land, whether agriculturally, mineral wise, whatever it might be that is revenue yielding. So essentially, we might call it monetized today. You think about things on the, how do you monetize your YouTube channel or whatever it is. So these lands, these are federal lands that are assigned to states, and states monetize those lands, often through selling them, but not always. But these lands are monetized, and that revenue is used to establish and fund institutions of higher education. And in accordance with the Morrill Act that sets up this scheme, these institutions of higher education are intended to teach agriculture, to teach military kind of tactics, to teach classical studies as well. And the big idea is to prepare citizens of the United States to participate in economic and civic and public life of the United States, of the nation, of the states in which they reside. So that's the concept of land grant universities. There are particular institutions within the states that are land grant universities, that are the benefactors, the beneficiaries, of this scheme. So here in Minnesota, the University of Minnesota is the designated land grant university. Michigan, that would be Michigan State. In the place where I come from, Texas, there's a system, University Texas A&M, that is the land grant university there in Texas. And you can kind of see the same thing across most states. Of course, I've said the word land probably like 60 times already. And you probably have in mind that this scheme rests upon the premise of dispossession of Indigenous nations. And because the federal government has no land to assign to states without having dispossessed Native nations of that land. And so the whole structure, the whole framework of land grant universities is about settler colonial dispossession of those lands. And universities that are land grant universities are existentially, kind of foundationally, fundamentally, whatever term you want to put there, embedded then in like the real immediate material process of settler colonial dispossession. And this then is why we might think of these, and they're often termed land grab universities. This is a phrase that's come into increasingly common use. And I'll show you a resource or a kind of a constellation of resources here in a second that might interest you, that address that issue of land grab universities. This is a phenomenon that happens across what is the United States, or understood to be the United States, in the 1860s and continues on. The policy is renewed sort of every generation in some sense, and expanded. Here in Minnesota, there are multiple things that happen as a result of this moral act. There are lands dispossessed from Dakota nations, primarily also from Ojibwe nations. There are lands that end up being monetized on behalf of the University of Minnesota, lands within the exterior boundaries of Minnesota that are monetized on behalf of the University of Minnesota, but there are many lands within the exterior boundaries of Minnesota that are monetized on behalf of universities elsewhere. And I'm going to do a quick screen share. I don't have like slides to scroll through, but I do have a few things that I want to show you. And this right here is one of the resources. I'll put the link in the chat in a second. I'll say it out loud now, landgrabu.org. Oops, I wanted to scroll, not zoom. Let's see, how are we doing here? There we go. So there's a project. Well, I'll say more about that in a moment. Let's just look at this map just for a second here. This map, as I've currently configured it, shows, first, let's just look at lands in Minnesota. Let's see, will this zap? There we go. All right. So these lands in Minnesota that are highlighted here, you can kind of see the outline of the state. It's pretty dark. These lands that are highlighted here are federal lands that were necessarily dispossessed of Native nations, conveyed to various states to be monetized on behalf of those states' land-grant universities, those states' public institutions of higher education. So we can see the indication of the lands there. If we add in this feature, it's going to show us the links between particular parcels of land and particular universities. And when we activate that feature, you can't really tell what's going on because it's so busy. There are so many parcels of land that are assigned to so many universities that this graphic, for practical zoom in purposes, is nonsense, just because of how much dispossession and reassignment of lands went on. So you can see that Minnesota, and Minnesota is somewhat exceptional in this. If we were to look at some other states, we wouldn't quite see the tidal wave of dispossession and external monetization that happens. And this is in part because of the historical moment of the 1860s. Minnesota is sort of the ground zero for dispossession of Indigenous lands when this act is passed. And that has a significant impact on what goes on at that time and the legacies of it. So again, here you can sort of see, and the fact that we can't really see maybe helps us appreciate the extent of the dispossession of Minnesota lands and how universities across, especially the eastern half and across the United States as it was in the 1860s, how that dispossession sort of takes place and the long reach of that. So I wanted to have a quick look at this map to give you a sense as to kind of what land-grant universities are and how this dispossession plays out. Now, here in Minnesota, like I said, there are significant parcels of land that are marshaled on behalf of the University of Minnesota. An example of this would be that there was a decent set of acres of land that were negotiated and dispossessed, negotiated under duress, inappropriate negotiations, but dispossessed of Dakota nations. There was a promise that the United States would pay $2,309 to the Dakota nations for this land. I'm told that payment was never made, and so when you negotiate to make a purchase and you take delivery of that purchase and you never pay for it, we have a term of art for this. It's called theft here in the United States. So even if you account for the $2,300, which is the amount that the United States agreed to pay for the land that was monetized on behalf of the university, what happens in the immediate aftermath of that is that land is sold for $579,430. So so clearly there's a market for that land. And it was sold over a period of time, over several decades actually, but it was sold consistently in order to fund the university. And the revenue from that ostensible $2,300 purchase was $579,000. So that's an immediate dispossession, or sort of a straight up raw dispossession of $577,000 and change. This would be $20 million right now in 2024. Interestingly, if you look at the University Foundation, this is like the fundraising arm of the University of Minnesota. They're always happy to trumpet their since inception rate of return. How good they are at managing the endowment of the university, managing the money that they bring in through philanthropic donations, receipts. And this ebbs and flows, this rate of return. It's down a little bit. It's 7.8% when I checked the other day. If you take that 7.8% return, that since inception return, apply it to that $577,000 dispossession, you would have $5 billion. This is more than the endowment of the University of Minnesota, well more than the current endowment of the University of Minnesota. So this dispossession of primarily Dakota and some Ojibwe lands that's made on behalf of the University of Minnesota is a staggering dispossession, a staggering amount of monetary value if we even accept that kind of framework, that outpaces the University of Minnesota's wealth in general. And so the upshot of that is that the University of Minnesota owes more than the entirety of its whole self to Native nations. The entire University of Minnesota, plus another third or more, has been dispossessed. And another way to look at it is that the University of Minnesota has kind of decreased the value of the dispossession in some strange ways. Anyhow, so this is a staggering dispossession, and there are all kinds of ways to play with those numbers. Some folks have done it in really interesting, far more sophisticated and earnest ways than me. I like to think of that $5 billion dispossession. Okay, let's look at that $5 billion dispossession and use some sort of conventional endowment math and say we should be devoting 4% of that to programs that are directed by Native nations and serve the interests of Native nations. That would be activity well beyond anything, of course, that's happening. That would be a transformational change to the university that we don't see on the horizon. So hopefully that gives you some sense of what land grant universities are. And in early 2020, which I still feel seems recent, but it's several years ago now. In early 2020, a few different things happened. I'm going to put some links in the chat in case you want to check this stuff out. And then I'll also do some screen sharing. Let's see, I'm just going to paste a mess in here and see what happens. Yeah, you can kind of see what's going on there. There's a link to the article that came out from High Country News that really dug into the actual lands associated with land grant universities. And then they created this landgrabu.org hub, information hub, data hub, research hub. And then the second thing that you'll see, so there's two links related to that. And then down below, you'll see where it says MIAC 2020 resolution. So in 2020, this entity, the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council, put forth a resolution pertaining to the University of Minnesota. The Minnesota Indian Affairs Council is an interesting entity. It's a state entity, state of Minnesota, established through state statute, operated by the state, has a staff who are state employees. It is a council. The Minnesota Indian Affairs Council is a pretty big council. It consists of commissioners of state agencies and departments, representatives from the legislature, representatives from the governor's office, and also elected leadership from tribal nations. There are 11 reservations. There are 7 Ojibwe reservations for Dakota communities within the exterior boundaries of the state of Minnesota. 10 of those 11 Native nations send delegates, usually their top level elected leader, to the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council. One of those Native nations does not participate in accordance with their sovereign decision-making, and 10 of them do participate in accordance with their sovereign decision-making. The chair of the Minnesota Affairs Council is currently the president of Lower Sioux Community, President Robert Larson. And the executive committee, that the sort of subcommittee of the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council, is those 10 right now tribal leaders. They're the only voting members of the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council. The other folks on there are non-voting members. And so this is an entity that's run by tribal leadership. And so when they put forth a resolution, the only people who vote in favor or against or otherwise in relation to a resolution are top level elected tribal leaders. So in 2020, this resolution comes forth, and let me get my screen share back up here. All right, so we've seen this map, and then Land Grab U is again a really great resource. This is the article that came out initially, exploring the phenomenon of land grant universities and their lands. And then here's just a quick glimpse at this resolution. And so this resolution observes a lot of things. It observes the often toxic relationship between the University of Minnesota and Native nations, and it calls upon the university to change that relationship and to take some real specific steps in doing so. Among the things that this resolution called upon the university to do is to undertake a system-wide exploration of itself, to do kind of an investigation, to look into the history of the University of Minnesota and its relationship with Native nations. And you can see that pop up here in a few different ways. So you can see in this provision of the resolution that the university's historical relationship has had impact on American Indian tribal governments and people. There's a call to conduct a truthful historic accounting of the university's past and present policies that have impacted American Indian peoples, and to just really look deeply and broadly into the history of the University of Minnesota. And so as a response to this resolution, the university partnered with Native nations to create a task force to pursue this study. My former colleague, Tad Johnson, who now happens to be a regent of the University of Minnesota, at the time he was serving as a senior director of American Indian Nations Relations, a long rhyming title in the university administration. And so he was charged with helping to coordinate this. He and I and some other folks worked with faculty who were pursuing a really broad Mellon Foundation grant in order to sort of embed this project as a subaward, if you will, under that grant. And through that funding, you know, I might as well note explicitly that the University of Minnesota did not invest directly in this process or support it directly. That it required TAD to go out and get external funding to make this all happen. So through that funding, there was a research framework, a community-driven, Native design, Native pursued research movement that came forth. The university took in some funding from the Mellon Foundation, redistributed that funding to Native nations, and all 11 did participate in this process in various ways. Even while not all of them accepted the money, they still participated. But that funding was redistributed to Native nations so that they could appoint their own tribal research fellows. And those tribal research fellows worked with graduate students and faculty from the University of Minnesota to develop individual tribal sort of reports on that tribe's experience with the university and what it felt like the university should be doing. And then also kind of a shared collaborative synthesis report about the university. And this is called the Truth Report. And I want to just put this up really quickly to honor 3 folks. If you want to know about the University of Minnesota Truth Report, the real folks you want to talk to are pictured here: Misty Blue, An Garagiola, and Audrianna Goodwin. These are the kind of core folks. Misty Blue was appointed by the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council to be the coordinator of the project from kind of the tribal side, if you will. An Garagiola of Bois Forte and Audrianna Goodwin of Red Lake were appointed as graduate students, graduate assistants to Tad Johnson as at the outset of this project to help to coordinate the university's contributions to the report. They did an exceptional job and continue to do an exceptional job continuing to develop and work in relation to this report. And so all the credit is due to them. I'm mildly embarrassed to be here talking about the Truth Report, their key voices and forces behind it, and want to honor that, though they're incredibly busy, both kind of representing and talking about the report, but in the various work that they do. So tribal research fellows, university grad students, faculty worked together and developed the Truth Project, the Truth Report. The report is housed by the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council. It's not something that's owned by the University of Minnesota. When the report was emerging, or the process was emerging, and the funding was being distributed, we took great care to make sure that tribal nations retain their inherent data sovereignty, control over the information, control over what they produced, and so they decided what they wanted of the material they generated and wrote, and the research that they undertook. They decided what they wanted to become public, what they didn't want to become public, and all of this is housed through the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council rather than the university. So let's see. I don't know if I got the. Let me put this link. I'll put this link in the chat too, so that if you want to go, I don't know. There we go. And I'm just now seeing that Molly had to take off, but has a good resource on this data sovereignty issue available for us there in the chat too. So if you want to read nearly 600 pages of Truth Report, now you know where to find it. And I say that a little bit tongue in cheek, but I'm serious. You should do it. Have a look at this thing and get beyond the executive summary. It's not 560 something pages of monotone single voice running through. There's a lot of different things going on, and so it can be approached in a lot of different ways and taken a piece at a time. So the Truth Project is described here, as you can see, and as sort of the description of this webinar gestured. It's a Native organized, Native-led, community-driven research movement. It's an ongoing movement, and what's happening here in accordance with that MIAC resolution is it's a look at the history and the present of universities' really fraught, complex relationships with Native nations, and also a significant assertion of recommendations, demands even that are put forth by the tribal research fellows, especially regarding what the university should be doing in order to step up and mind its relations with Native nations. That kind of brings me back then to what I said earlier about the 1854 treaty, and there are many other treaties that pertain to what we now call the state of Minnesota, and therefore what we call the University of Minnesota and the lands in which the university is situated, and more broadly where it does its work. And that's a key principle for this project, and something that's largely shared by the participants, and understanding that if it weren't for these treaty relationships, the state of Minnesota doesn't exist, the University of Minnesota doesn't exist. And those treaty relationships entail deep and wide obligations that the university needs to step up and tend to. Even while it's a federal tribal nation-to-nation relationship, those treaty obligations pertain to anyone who avails themselves, or any institution that avails themselves of the benefits that the United States gains under those treaties. So the university is obligated both to ensure that it does not behave in ways that undermine Indigenous nations as Indigenous nations exercise their reserved inherent rights, whether resource governance, a broad array of stated and unstated things. The university has to make sure that it um, doesn't disrupt the exercise of those rights. There are many ways that it does do that it does disrupt that, and those are crises. Those are all crises that undermine the legitimacy or the would-be legitimacy of the university. And then, in addition to like not doing harm, there's also doing good work. And there are obligations to do good work and to serve the needs of Native nations based on how Native nations understand and identify those needs and direct the university to do so. So this is all like existential in a real base way. I tend to say that the first order of business of any settler government, of any settler-oriented institution, should be to mind its treaty obligations. That should be what any settler community does. That needs to be the first thing, its first priority, because if it fails to do that, then it sweeps its own rug out from under itself and delegitimizes its own self. So the university is no exception to that. The Truth Report is a mechanism through which Native nations very generously and graciously, with exceptional generosity and grace, completely undeserved, offer to the university pathways for minding those relationships. And this report, came out nearly a year ago now, and the report, like I said, is incredibly gracious and generous in offering to the university many pathways. And so here we kind of wait, if you will, to see how the university is going to respond. But it's not appropriate for me to say that phrase, right? For me to say, well, here I am waiting to see how the university is going to respond, because I am the university. Many of us are parts of universities, and that sort of waiting to see how the university is going to respond has sort of been the primary response to the Truth Report. There's a great deal of interest in it, a great deal of hope. There's a great deal of ways in which various people that are associated with the university and units within the university see themselves in the report and hope that resources will come our way by virtue of the report. Those tendencies are not necessarily wrong, but they might not be the most productive. There's a general sense, our department has, of course, kept close track of the Truth Report. We participated in its development, and we've been watching very closely to see how this plays out. And we've had various conversations with folks who have a little bit broader decision-making authority here on our campus. And the overwhelming tendency is to say, well, we're waiting to see what the regents do, or we're waiting to see what the system does, or we're waiting to see if funding streams are going to be changed over in order to start to address this. And my response to that, which I have said as a response to folks, and that I'll articulate here in a little bit more of the abstract, is that the University of Minnesota Duluth has already received its resources to do the work that it needs to do. It's received its resources from the get-go. The University of Minnesota Duluth and none of our campuses should be awaiting a kind of new windfall of new resources that will enable us to step up and mind our obligations. That should happen, but it's not something that we should be waiting on. Any resources that the university has are derived from the dispossession of Indigenous nations. And so the resources that we already have at whatever level we are within an institution, the first order of business ought to be to apply those resources toward minding our relations with Native nations. Again, like we shouldn't be waiting for some kind of windfall to do this work. We already have received it, and we're not doing the work. And so everybody needs to look at their sphere of influence and reorient that sphere of influence in relation to this. At the big picture, there are leadership meetings between top leadership of the university and top leadership of Native nations. There's a senior advisor in Native American Affairs who runs the Office of Native American Affairs at that top system level. Karen Diver, former tribal chair at Fond du Lac, former member of of the Obama presidential administration. So really capable top level leadership doing really good work. There's a staff there, project manager, NAGPRA coordinator. And so it's happening at that level. And there are priorities that are being articulated by tribal leadership that the university is working on. This happens slower and doesn't happen always in ways that we would like. And that's a real problem. I don't mean to kind of set that aside. But that is a real problem that we all need to be agitating for folks who make decisions in other spheres of influence than us to be making good decisions. And then we need to be making good decisions in our spheres of influence. One of the things that happened when the Truth Report was released, was a lot of statements saying, "Hey, we endorse the Truth Report," or we're learning from this, or whatever it might be. The department that I work in with my primary appointment, American Indian Studies, here at UMD, precisely did this kind of thing. And so I'll share the screen here and I'll find this link too. And we sort of took the approach of an affirmation of the report. And so we offer our gratitude to the team, to the folks who contributed, and we affirm the findings of the report. And then, we acknowledge that we're not in a position to make all of the decisions that need to be made in order for the university to step up to the report. But we also acknowledge that we have a great deal of responsibility within our department and opportunity to be a part of the university's transition to stepping up to minding relations. And so we talk about the things that we're doing that we feel can be enhanced and contribute to the report's recommendations. And then we talk about how we feel that we can and should and will work to step up to these recommendations. And so you can use that link to sort of look through in detail where we have identified several of the Truth Report recommendations that we feel we have a particular capacity and capability to contribute to. And so we talk about this here, and it sort of serves as kind of strategic planning. Like we're given this gift from Native nations to direct our work. And so these are the ways that we're trying to be responsive to that. And so we're marshaling the resources that we have on behalf of these trajectories, and we're working really hard to gather resources from outside of the university because the university doesn't yet seem particularly materially invested in these things. So we're working hard to gather resources that we can from outside of the university to make good on these pathways, to respond to these recommendations. So that's what I have for you today. I appreciate your patience. I'm not surprised that I talked longer than I expected, so I guess I am surprised, but I'm not surprised. I want to put a couple more links into the chat on kind of more recent articles that jump off from that land grab university work from High Country News. Many of these involving Misty, Ann, and Audrianna in various combinations. The work that they continue to do is just astoundingly impressive. So that's kind of my big picture understanding of land grab universities, how the University of Minnesota, especially the University of Minnesota Duluth, fits in, and how we're orienting ourselves or trying to orient ourselves to that. I appreciate your patience with me, your reluctance to hurl disruptions and critiques is well taken, though I'm suspicious of you for not having done that. In any case, I would welcome a conversation about any of the things that have come up or things that you're surprised haven't come up.
Thank you so much, Joseph. I know I learned a lot. I've been half following it, but I struggle under a lot. So I really appreciate that. Yeah, we don't have to do this formally, but I thought I'd chime in and tell you we're not doing this formally. Please just unmute and ask a question, or throw it in the chat and I can read it out loud if you prefer that method. But now I'll be quiet for the 30 seconds that it takes for people to ask questions. So jump in before then if you want.
I guess I do have a question, and thank you, Joseph. I very much appreciate hearing all of this information, especially being a student at the university. Um, and just kind of wondering about, okay, yeah, the university is like taken this first step of maybe acknowledgement. But I feel like it has kind of ended there, and kind of how do we keep pushing this institution to like take that next step? Or I'm thinking about how the Cloquet Forestry Center has been part of a land back conversation, and then there's been pushback from that from within the university system. And yeah, just that repeated pushback is frustrating to me. So I can imagine other people who are much more closely tied to that land. So yeah, just curious what thoughts there are about what are next steps when there's so much tension within an institution.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. Appreciate you getting us going there. And thanks for joining us today and your work here as a student, which I hope is going well. Yeah, so I think what comes to mind is, and this phrase, the spheres of influence, is kind of borrowed from a colleague in conversations about this. You want to make the decisions that you have the sort of parameter and purview to make decisions, thinking in light of this, and then you also want to do what you can to um, to pressure those who have different spheres of influence to make decisions, and that is, that's hard to do. It's hard to do effectively. It's hard to have influence, frankly, on decision makers often. That issue of the Cloquet Forestry Center. So what Shannon is referring to there is land within the Fond du Lac Reservation that the university holds title to, that is used as an experimental forestry station and education and research location. And it is a real kind of embarrassment for the university to be doing that sort of work in that place and to be holding those lands. And it also is being fixed, long overdue, and a bit of a cumbersome process. I did hear that at the most recent meeting of the Board of Regents that they did move this forward in a significant way. And so that land back, if you will, I feel pretty assured is happening. Uh, though we don't know what it looks like, I think there will be an ongoing relationship, and there will be activities that remain university oriented at that place, at least for some amount of time, which is probably how Fond du Lac might want it in some ways. Um, so I think, Shannon, I don't entirely know what program you're in or what you're up to here, but I bet there are already or some emerging initiatives that you might be pretty close to that are responding to the Truth Report. I know there are folks who are working with us to maybe develop some programming for university faculty and grad students to help increase the likelihood that research that happens here is tribally directed, and emerges out of research questions and needs and aspirations that tribes have. Our colleague Julie Ederson is heavily involved in that work, and so that's an instance where folks are trying to work within their spheres of influence and even trying to reach, stretch those spheres of influence in order to take responsibility for stepping up. As you know, Shannon, probably we've got a lot of interim leadership in our institution from the system level and here at the campus level at multiple layers. And so there's a real reluctance among those folks to make interesting decisions. And so there's a lot of obstacles. But we can have influence over, hopefully, the replacement of those interim folks with more permanent folks. And we can have input into those processes. We're learning today about candidates for the chancellor leader position, the top administrator at this campus. And so there's opportunities to try to nibble away at things, and then there's opportunities to change how we do our own work. And I encourage everyone to do that. And frankly, it's a lot easier for me to do some of that because I'm in the Department of American Indian Studies, and it's just kind of part and parcel to our mission and our programming. It can be more challenging for folks in other programs to think about, okay, how do I make this the first order of business? But there are always ways, and we encourage folks to at least ask that question and talk with colleagues about what that can look like, and of course, build relationships with Native peoples and Native nations to try to ascertain what that can look like.
Can I also chime in with a thought on that question? So Shannon and I did my master's at UMD in the Integrated Biosciences Department. And now I'm doing my PhD at Lakehead. And the student organizing at Lakehead is much more, and in Canada, from what I understand, has a richer history than what I experienced in Minnesota. And so like students writing letters, either as a club or just as a group of students. So something happened. So if something happens, we might email everyone who's in our program, which sometimes it's hard to know. I know that those things are sometimes not transparent, but trying to get like just a group of students together and writing a letter to your faculty and saying, this report came out, and as students, we are supportive of the Cloquet Forestry Center being returned, or whatever language you want to choose. So just to say, I didn't think that was possible when I was at the University of Minnesota as a grad student. I have since learned that that's not true. So just to name, maybe that's possible, but like student organizing can be a way, and you can sort out the various ways that would be most effective. But when I hear Joseph talking a little bit about agitating those higher levels, or that's still your sphere of influence, is that you're a student in their department who hopefully will want to finish in that department and speak well of that department when you graduate. And so like by voicing to them that's a thing you care about, it becomes clear to them. Whereas if they don't hear anything from students around that, then they have no idea that you might be upset about it or care about it, or whatever verb you want to use. So anyway, that was something that I wish someone had told me earlier in my life. So I thought I would share it now.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Thanks for the question. I do have a question, but I would really love somebody else to also ask a question. If anyone has one. Okay, I'll ask it, and then someone else will have to. It seems like Joseph, it seems like maybe Minnesota is the first state to go through this process of this sort of really big formal process and report around these land grab universities. Is that true, or have other states or other tribal entities indicated interest in doing something similar? I guess I'm wondering how it may or may not be happening in other places.
Yeah, sure. I should have prepared to say something about this, and I'm regretting, of course, that I didn't. I do know that there are several structures at hand in Minnesota that kind of enable this in a kind of formal. There's the institution of the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council. There's the University of Minnesota system is both the kind of key R1 institution in the state, and really the only one, and the land grant university, right? Other states are in different contexts, in different circumstances, where there's a little more of a complex choreography that might have to happen for this to take place. And so I think that's part of what's going on, or part of the reason that the truth report is, an early iteration of this kind of thing. That being said, there are other universities, especially that have undertaken similar partnered projects. There are universities, I'm going to say the wrong one. I think the University of Denver did a early kind of self-study and partnership with Native nations. In South Dakota, there's a project, not necessarily land grant kind of motivated, but a project there. Harvard has done a big report, a multifaceted kind of report. So a lot of universities have been working toward this or doing this. Indeed, the University of Minnesota is kind of early on, or one of the early pursuits of a project like this, but not totally unique. Though I think a lot of folks, I had the great pleasure of going to a pretty conventional, like, academic conference of historians, going with the core team with Misty Blue and An Garagiola and Audrianna Goodwin to present the kind of truth report and the process. And so we had a panel that the four of us were on, and there was a ton of interest because everybody knew that their universities were probably going to about to be doing this. So there is kind of that idea that, you know, that Minnesota's is a kind of pilot project for other states and other Native nations and other universities to look at. Though I don't have like the data on who's first and who did this and when. But there is a sense that the University of Minnesota is on the early edge of this. And I can also tell you from playing a very small role in the process from the get-go that we didn't have many models to look at, you know, so that tells you something, that there weren't a lot of folks who had invented a wheel that was relevant for us to use. So we definitely had that sense.
Great, thank you. Yeah. We have time for one more question. Anyone have one more thing they want to throw out there? All right, that's okay. Joseph, I will take all these links and I'll put them on the website along with the recording. So folks, I think Zoom lets you save the chat these days, but I will include all of the links on the website with the recording if you wanted to share them out to folks or whatever. Thank you so much. We really appreciated you being here, Joseph. Thanks to everyone for coming and attending. And everyone can have a great day out in the watershed.
Yeah, much gratitude to y'all for taking the time to be here and to engage, and for folks who are suffering through the video later, much gratitude to y'all as well. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks everyone. Have a good one.